not going live. I'm looking. Oh, it's over there. It's live. I see it. It's over there. It's like it's a game for me. It's like, hey, there it is. What's happening, wrestling fans. It's Doug is very entertained by like little red lights edition of Two Bros Wrestling Show.
On a Tuesday night, the state of the Two Bros nation is strong. At least tonight. It wasn't so much Sunday night.
No, it was not. There were infrastructure problems on Sunday night.
The state of our union was not strong on Sunday night, so we apologize for the last minute cancellation. But Doug, there's a little bit of a serendipitous, I guess you could say, scheduling because we were going to do the show on Sunday, and our main event topic concerns the history of women's wrestling. Wrestling. The history of women's wrestling, and today is the first day of Women's History Month. So, in some way,
it's like the universe just pushed the show for us to make it appropriate, you know.
Yeah, so. It's like, hey, what are you doing? It's not, you can't do this at the very end of February. Wait till Women's History Month and let's do the history of women's wrestling, which is what we're talking about in our main event topic. But Doug, as we do, before we get to there, it is time for ding, ding, ding.
What? You don't have the bell? Come on, man.
I'm watching the overrun here. That was an amazing main event on NXT, so I'm running a little bit late. I don't have it queued up, but I apologize. We'll get it together.
Eventually, we'll get it together.
We're still having the opening bell because it was a busy news week. Doug, headline this week: Cesaro, his contract has expired, and
quietly expired, where everybody else was getting like 3-year extensions. He just got a tiny little 1-year extension. What the hell is wrong with WWE?
Apparently 11 years worth of service was not exactly it was not exactly repaid with any sort of loyalty. Cesaro's contract was basically allowed to expire. They were in negotiations, and he did get an offer, and unfortunately for Cesaro, unlike a lot of folks who've been getting extensions lately, they lowballed him on the deal, and Cesaro stuck to his guns and just let his contract run out. But as such, this isn't a typical WWE story of letting someone go or future endeavors or 90-day no-compete clauses. His contract expired. He can show up anywhere he wants, whenever he wants. So, Doug, Revolution this weekend. What do you think?
I would love to see that. You know, I would love to see that, you know, Cesaro is all elite. You know, I mean, Tony has an embarrassment of riches already with his talent roster at this point. But, you know, 1 or 2 more couldn't hurt. I mean, you know, he doesn't have to pay for Cody now, right?
There's some money freed up there. I mean, you got to pick and choose, obviously, as to what can move the needle and what can't. Cesaro's push in WWE has always been fits and starts. They never got behind him for long periods of time. He was, you know, often thought of as a tag team wrestler, almost as an enhancement wrestler.
A good hand.
A good hand. Somebody help the young guys get over. I could see a Cesaro making a difference in the AEW if pushed the way that we know that Cesaro could or should be pushed. So who knows? Tony's always talking big announcements. He claims to have another one for tomorrow night on Dynamite.
He does. So
who knows? It could be. I mean, these days, we just saw the former Buddy Murphy be the big reveal last week. Buddy Murphy is a talented individual. I think that he'll go far in the AEW, but compared to someone like with the track record of a Cesaro, we're talking a man who could be top of the card right off the bat in my mind.
Absolutely. Cesaro, I think Cesaro is great, man. I really do. I never understood why Vince, did not think of him as a top tier talent. I mean, what was the last year he had his moment in the sun with at WrestleMania with Seth Rollins, and that just kind of fizzled afterwards. But
that's those stop and go starts. Just when you think that, okay, they finally get it, he got his moment. Now there's going to be a sustained push. suddenly he'd disappear for weeks at a time, and it was back to pretty much the way it's been for most of his 11-year tenure of just can't get any momentum. I'd love to see him get momentum wherever he ends up next.
Absolutely.
On the other end of the spectrum, however, AJ Styles has actually re-signed with WWE. His contract isn't due just yet. Apparently, it was on its way to expiring either this spring or later on this summer, depending on which reports you believe. But either way, WWE did not want to get in this same sort of situation where they're negotiating right down to the very end, or even tempt the fact that an AJ Styles could go all elite or elsewhere on them. So they made a point to lock him up. By all accounts, AJ has said that he would love to retire from WWE and would like to work backstage at WWE. So he seems more like a company man at this point. And they do understand the value of at least some of their talent still, because apparently he got somewhere around the $3 million range, if the reports are to be believed.
Yeah. AJ's what, 40-ish now? So, I think he's ready to transition into something else. I think in other interviews he said he doesn't have many years in the ring left and is looking for a nice little transition. I think he can retire comfortably from WWE and live out behind the scenes. I think he'll be good with that. So
you got to think about your family. His legacy is secure. He's done everything. I mean, he's been at the top of the cards on WrestleManias, and as well as in the Tokyo Dome. And he was Mr. TNA for a decade or more, Ring of Honor before that. I mean, you couldn't ask for, at this point, if you offered me $3 million a year to coast into a backstage job, I would probably be signing the dotted line too and taking care of my family, because there's nothing left.
Absolutely.
Styles to prove. There's been a subtle shift, folks, if you've noticed, in the way that WWE has begun to advertise the main event of WrestleMania. When they first started advertising the WrestleMania main event, it was Lesnar Reigns in a winner-take-all title versus title match, they would call it. Now they're calling it a winner-take-all title unification match. So all indications are that one of these championships is going away. You won't see a man walking around with two belts. We're thinking more along the lines of a old school Chris Jericho situation where you have a unified world champion, which I'm excited about. I like that idea. If there's one world you live upon, you should have one world champion.
And not a universal champion, which I've always thought was a little silly. I mean, I get it from a marketing standpoint that it's the WWE universe. I've always thought that was silly, though. And I would like to see a unified title and, our tribal chief, owning that unified title where he can cross brands back and forth between SmackDown and Raw and demand his acknowledgement. At least that's the way I see that going.
When you have it as a unification match instead of title versus title, it actually adds more intrigue to the match to me, and it also feels like a bigger deal, particularly when you talk these two gentlemen that are in this contest and you put it on the line on Sunday night, which they've already announced. It's the last night of WrestleMania. It's the final match of the WrestleMania weekend. It very much seems appropriate to have it even mean more by making it unification. So Kota Ibushi is unfortunately hit a bit of a speed bump in his comeback from injury. He has been put on back on the shelf technically today, but with the time change, it would have been last night, was the 50th anniversary show for New Japan Pro Wrestling, and that was supposed to be the night of his big comeback, but they pulled him from it, and it wasn't just even though there's not reports on how serious the setback may be, it's obviously not just a one-night thing, as he's also been pulled from the upcoming New Japan Cup tournament, which would have began here in a couple hours, and opening round matches for that. He hasn't wrestled since October when he was in the G1 Climax finals, and they had to bring the finals to an abrupt halt when he legit suffered a shoulder injury, and the referee had to call for the bell in the main event of one of their bigger annual events. So Ibushi is apparently not quite healed the way that they thought. So we'll see. And best of luck that it's a minor setback, because way too talented for that to be something serious and nagging for Kota Ibushi.
Absolutely. Kota Ibushi is an amazing, amazing talent. If you folks out there in video land haven't seen him, go Google him right now. Go just stop what you're doing. Come back to us, but go stop what you're doing and go watch his matches, then come back. We'll wait. Okay, glad you're back. What do we tell you? Great.
We did not lie. The man is worth seeing. So hopefully, I mean, it's still young too. So, hopefully the healing powers there take over and he can make a successful comeback.
Healing powers activate.
Activate. John Morrison, Doug, is back in the news. He has rejoined AAA.
Does he also have like a new name to go with his new promotion he's in now?
He's Johnny Superstar, which, if you're counting at home, folks, is what's his real name? Like John Henstridge, something like that?
I want to say Hennigan, maybe? I don't know. But
this is, in his career, this is the 11th name that he has worked under. So he's got to be going for some kind of record here as far as nom de plumes go. Speaking of AAA, Doug, the promotion kicked off its 2022 season with the Rey de Reyes special event. Included a number of different surprises. The most prominent being, I would think, the return of speaking of John Morrison, the return of John Morrison's wife to AAA, where she's had some of her biggest victories in the past, and that is Taya Valkyrie. In addition, there also was the surprise of Carlos Cabrera calling the action for the national television broadcast. Cabrera parted ways with WWE here not that long ago after 29 years at WWE's Spanish announce table, but he was reunited with a former WWE Spanish announce table figure that was with him for much of that time. And so Hugo Savinovich and Carlos Cabrera are back on the call, just not at the Spanish announce table that we saw smashed through all those years in during the Attitude Era. They're now down calling the matches in AAA.
Good
One
for
more
them.
AAA story.
Taya Valkyrie was with NXT for like a cup of coffee, right? Was she ever used on TV?
Foxy Monet, Rexy Mo? I don't even remember. It was Frankie Monet is what. She was never Frankie Monet. I mean, Taya Valkyrie, that's a cool name. Frankie Monet was doomed from the start. She probably knew the writing was on the wall between her age and then the gimmick they gave her.
Yeah.
AAA is once again trying to enter the American market. They are planning on touring in the United States, primarily Texas, a couple of the larger cities, maybe some smaller venues this time around, but New York, Chicago, the like. They're also supposedly closing in on a television deal in the United States, TV clearance with one of America's Spanish language networks. So rumors if it's, Univision or Telemundo or something like that. But it looks like if you are a fan of AAA, that you might have a way of watching it here in the United States shortly. Ring of Honor has completed its inaugural Hall of Fame class that will be inducted at the promotion's restart here in a few weeks when they kick back off during WrestleMania weekend. The class now, the inaugural class of the Hall of Fame for Ring of Honor consists of the Briscoes, Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, and Samoa Joe. And really, is there any?
My God, what a lineup!
Seriously, when you think Ring of Honor, there's a lot of folks who've contributed to the multi-decade success of Ring of Honor. But if you were doing a Mount Rushmore, who's missing there? I mean, those are the guys.
There it is. Absolutely. I mean, yes.
WWE would be hard pressed to come up with a similar Hall of Fame class this year that has as much prestige as that group.
Wow, and all those folks who made it to WWE, with the exception of the Briscoes, who I don't think have ever really cared to travel to WWE. They are ROH lifers.
For life. Yep. Yeah. And we'll be there on the restart too, defending the ROH Tag Team Championships on April the 1st. And Doug, we'll end with NWA news. The NWA Crockett Cup tournament brackets had been revealed, and the NWA Tag Team Champions, La Rebellion, have earned the #1 overall seed, while the Ring of Honor Tag Team Champions, there we go again, former GCW Tag Team Champs as well, those Briscoe brothers are also they've come in at the #2 seed. There's other notable teams participating, including the OGK, former Ring of Honor guys there. That's the Matt Taven and Mike Bennett tag team. Strictly Business, the Dirty Sexy Boys are part of this as well. So a lot of good.
Which is a great tag team.
And it's JTG, who used to be Crime Time, and the Dirty Dango, as he's known now. They are fantastic on NWA. So I mean, if there is a bright side about WWE having too many toys, when these guys walk, sometimes they find a second life, even if it's not in front of as large of an audience. You remember why it was that you were hopeful to begin with, that there was a whole lot more that Fandango was capable of than what he was being allowed to do. And now you're seeing it. It's like, oh man, this is some good stuff. But that is the opening bell. Doug, are you ready to move on?
Let's talk about ladies in wrestling, Kevin.
Let's talk about ladies in wrestling. And that is our main event topic. It is Women's History Month. And obviously, professional wrestling is a tough business. It's always been a tough business, hard business to break into, hard lifestyle to lead. But without question, as tough as it is, and as it still is, it's always been tougher depending on what group of individuals you're referring to. Doug and I sort of modeled this show a little bit over something we did a couple of years ago when we, for Black History Month, did a show on the history of racism in professional wrestling. And obviously, as far as marginalized groups go, and making the hurdles even harder, particularly in the past, women have had it also extremely rough up until really recent times, when we start to see a lot more parity in the way that women are treated compared to the men. So that's a little bit of what we're talking about tonight, where we are today in women's wrestling, which is really a golden age, but how we got to here and all the many obstacles that women had to overcome. Doug, we're talking opportunity for one, sexism, obviously, and not just by promoters. We're talking the other talent and fans, getting fans to really respect and appreciate women's wrestling as more than just a sideshow, because that's really the way it was presented for decades, as just a the same as things that you don't see anymore, like midget wrestling so much. And I mean, it was a novelty and not considered serious.
Very, very much so. I mean, going through and doing the research for this, it was very interesting, because I started to realize that growing up, as a late 70s, early 80s, kid watching wrestling, I don't really actually recall ladies wrestling, no women's wrestling. I can't remember anything from the Jim Crockett promotion. I'm sure it was there. Maybe it wasn't. I don't honestly remember. I remember, women in wrestling being more of the valets, the eye candy to the men. But we'll get into that as we talk about this. But I don't know about you, but I can't really recall anything until we get into like the more modern era of professional wrestling.
Part of that is that when we first became fans, Doug, it was kind of in that down period for women's wrestling. It had existed previously and more prominent, and we were there right before it came back into prominence. So let's talk a little bit about where we began.
Let's do it.
Got some slides here.
Look at you putting together a slideshow.
What you're looking at, Doug, is the first women's world champion that was recognized in 1937. This is Mildred Burke. She had been a stenographer who fell in love with professional wrestling after seeing her first wrestling match. And that wrestling match included the Missouri heavyweight champion, Billy Wolfe, who will feature prominently in our discussion today. But years later, Wolfe would become Mildred's second husband and her manager. So he sort of helped shepherd her in the business. She began wrestling in 1935, wrestling men at carnivals, which is how it was done back in the day. But because Billy Wolfe was her manager and the two of them together had this entrepreneurial spirit, she basically, I mean, when you're one of a kind, you can sort of, do what you wish. And they pretty much just chose to declare her the women's world champion. And as such, they marketed her as the champion. So they would lend her out to other shows. Again, they were considered attraction matches. They weren't equal with the men. It wasn't like there was a federation of women, a rosters full of women, and like we see today. It was Mildred traveling the circuit as a self-proclaimed world champion, and they would bring in other female talent to face her, to basically as a sideshow to some of these cards. And as though a world champion who traveled as she did, the NWA did recognize her as their first heavyweight champion. And Doug, she was the NWA World's Women's Champion for nearly 20 years.
There are several females, we'll talk about another one later, who was like a world champion for 20 some years as well, though. Those belts did not change hands. Of course, in Mildred's case, it was helpful that, she was married to not only, her manager, but, her manager was also a promoter,
Yes.
who would, so of course, that led to their own troubles with their marriage, apparently, since there was some extramarital issues on the road.
Well, yes. Billy was a known womanizer. And obviously, Mildred, who really could handle it only so long, she left him. And again, this gets to the sexism of the wrestling industry at the time. So the reason that she ended up losing the world title, she didn't lose the world title so much as she couldn't find work because Billy was a man and Mildred was just a woman who didn't have any power invested in her. And so Billy basically blackballed her. She couldn't find any place to work. So she started her own league. So she retired after 20 years of being the NWA World Champion and started what would be known as the World Women's Wrestling Association. So she was training other women to be a part of a women's, which, at the time would have been really progressive. And she was their world champion for 2 years. And upon her, retirement in 1956. However, the retirement was because the venture went bankrupt. And one of the reasons it went bankrupt, again, back to Billy Wolfe. And just to show you how unfair the laws and such and the wrestling industry was to women at the time, the courts awarded in the bankruptcy proceedings, awarded the entire promotion and the stable of wrestlers to Mildred's ex-husband, Billy Wolfe. So then Billy goes to the NWA and basically meets with the board on the future of women's wrestling. And Mildred, who, to this day, the NWA World Women's Championship on the NWA Power and things, they refer to it as the Burke, because it is her legacy. But at the time, the NWA left Mildred in the lobby. Women were not allowed in the meetings. So the only representation for women's wrestling, again, her ex-husband, Billy Wolfe. And what they ended up doing is they basically, the NWA gave up on women's wrestling. They just decided it wouldn't be featured. And they eventually, after a brief break, decided to, start it back up again. And they just declared another woman's champion who, in her own right, would have quite a legacy. I'm not sure that obviously she's as known as some of the other women on this list, but this is Penny Baker. And Penny was sort of that transitional champion where it wasn't Mildred and it wasn't what was coming next. But she was the restart of women's wrestling, and she was sort of the, Billy Wolfe's replacement at the time, because again, a womanizer. And this is I guess where we'll get to somebody that I think that most of our fans, Doug, are going to know and recognize, because
there she is,
Lillian, as she was known at the time, real name, soon to be christened the Fabulous Moolah. Moolah was trained by Mildred Burke, the first women's world champion, along with her husband and manager at the time, they took Moolah in. And from all accounts, this situation became a bit of a, well, shall we say, a love triangle. So Billy ends up having a relationship with Moolah as he did with Mildred. And so that is how Fabulous Moolah became a world champion, a title that she would hold almost as long as
Right.
actually longer, really, than what Mildred had done before, Doug.
Didn't Moolah hold the belt for like what 28 years?
Yes, there. It's kind of like the Ric Flair holding of the title, where there'd be like these one night changes, and of course, it was in the era then things didn't get reported. But for the most part, she controlled that belt for 28 years.
That's that's insane.
It's insane. And though, if you owned the belt, I mean, if you weren't part of a promotion and you were just there promoting yourself, you were an true independent contractor in these days, and you were just going town to town, and your gimmick is I'm a women's world champion. That's pretty much what women's wrestling was back in those days. Moolah would train other women along with Billy, would train these women to come and yeah. And that's, you bring you book your competition. It wasn't rosters of women and bookers deciding. You would sell yourself and your opponent as an addition to their card. And that's the way it worked. Billy looks like a little bit of a womanizer.
When you sent me some notes on this, I also had this question: who was Billy Wolfe?
It makes you wonder if you're tuning in and thinking, I thought the night show was about women's wrestling. Why are we talking about this man named Billy Wolfe? For better or for worse, the legacy of women's wrestling runs through Billy Wolfe. Whether you talk Mildred for the first 20 years or Moolah's reign for 28 years, all of that is linked to the man on the screen. And Doug, I think it's important to not only talk about him because he was there as part of the history, but if we wanted to talk also about the issues that women had and the problems that women had, he's pretty emblematic of the way this industry chewed women up and spit them out.
Yeah, I think he is, the founder and poster child of a lot of issues in women's wrestling. This guy here on the screen, because I mean, just a quick Google search and you'll find out how awesome of a guy this dude was not.
Absolutely piece of crap. And so from that end, I mean, when a young Lillian, Fabulous Moolah gets involved and is treated as property in the same way that Mildred had been done before her. I mean, obviously, it's a sad story, and it's really sad what Moolah had to go through with him. Unfortunately, though, in addition to enduring Billy Wolfe, Doug, unfortunately, Moolah also seems to have learned some things from her mentor. In some ways, the practices of Billy Wolfe were sort of things that Moolah took on herself.
It does appear to be very cyclical when you read about Billy Wolfe, all the things that he did to his wife, his other wrestlers in the stable, that he had, and then when you start to read about Moolah and how she had these training camps, or I mean, she apparently stacked her deck in definitely her favor, and I think she did learn a lot from this guy, because there's a lot of allegations floating around to this day about Moolah and some of her less than unfair practices and how she would treat her wrestlers and really just pimp them out. There's really no other way to say it, but if you do a quick Google search of this, you'll start finding this stuff too, where she would wrestlers would pay to train with the champion, but the champion was never training anybody. She would force them to do things like have them sign contracts to live on her property, but then they would have to pay rent to her in addition to paying for their training. And then she would basically put these girls in debt. And then if they did go anywhere, she had a claim to their earnings or partial earnings through like these CD contracts. It very, very interesting read.
So I misspoke earlier when I said Penny Baker. It was actually wait a minute, I lost it here. June Byers. That's who the NWA restarted with. June Byers as the champion. So my apologies there. I wanted to make that link because that is where Moolah enters the picture as basically women's wrestling for 3 decades. 1954. Instead of acknowledging June Byers as their champion, the NWA began to switch things over to Moolah. Moolah had become the junior heavyweight women's champion for the NWA, and they then began to have what was originally could be considered the first WWE, WWF, I guess at the time, women's championship. And so it sort of got convoluted into you're just the overall women's champ now. And she took over Billy Wolfe's role as women's wrestling gatekeeper for 3 decades.
Definitely, yeah, that's an excellent adjective. Definitely, gatekeeper of women's wrestling. Is all women's wrestling really went through her.
If you wanted to be anywhere in women's wrestling, you had to contend with Fabulous Moolah. 3 controversial decades where if you wanted to work in the United States, you had no choice but to deal with Moolah. And Doug, that makes it where I'll ask you, how do you assess? How does one assess Moolah's place in history? Because you can't talk women's wrestling without talking about Fabulous Moolah. She's a towering figure who really was women's wrestling for 30 years. However, because of the controversies that you mentioned, it makes it difficult to laud her as a pioneer. A lot of this stuff didn't really come out until after her death. I mean, it should be noted that Vince McMahon loved her so much that they gave her a world title run when she was 76 years old. They put the belt back on her. They, put her in their Hall of Fame. They, named the Battle Royal, the Women's Battle Royal at WrestleMania after her. And then only after they did that, Doug, did women start really coming forward and start telling these stories. It's kind of like the Bill Cosby thing, if you want to, Yeah. It's like for years, it's a well-known secret that everyone just decided to keep until somebody decided that they were going to say something, and then suddenly the floodgates open.
And then everybody's saying something. I can't really speak to Moolah's wrestling ability. Clearly, she was a ruthless businesswoman to, basically, in such a man's environment, to go in and establish herself and run things the way she did. I'm not saying what she did was great, because I mean, if you read about her, she sounds just like a piece of crap, just like Billy Wolfe.
Yeah.
But then there are other wrestlers I'm reading, going through here, who've never had a bad thing to say about her and don't understand where these allegations come from. But I don't know. It's one of those. Who do you believe? But I have a hard time believing that a bunch of people throughout the decades would all come forward with very similar stories, and there not be some link to link everything together. But
Penny Banner was one of the more famous wrestlers, and I think that's where I got my pennies confused earlier when Penny with Jenny. But Penny Banner was one of the famous wrestlers who first came out against Moolah, who would bring the accusation of actual pimping. She further claimed that the women that Moolah would book to go out on these tours had no idea.
Yes, I read this. These girls would have no idea until they were out on the road with the promoters and the other wrestlers. They were basically the sexual entertainment, as much as they were like, a talent on the road, as a sideshow attraction or whatever. And from what it sounds like, if these girls weren't compliant, they were forced to be compliant, or at least from the allegations.
It's hard to imagine that it could be worse than just saying, hey, you're going to have to do this if you want to work in this business. That's bad enough. That is exploitation, sexual exploitation. But to think that she sent out a lot of times these pretty young, innocent, don't know what they're in for women, thinking they're going to be working wrestling matches, and had already made the backstage deals that she basically was selling them into sexual slavery if these allegations are true. And further, Doug, allegations are that Moolah herself would take advantage of some of her recruits.
Yes. Yes, and then, and then from what I'm reading, we tell some of her lesbian, her lesbian. I forgot the girl's name, but she was an outed lesbian wrestler, who Moolah said, "No, you need to date men, but you don't you need to go out in public with men. You can't be seen with women." Yet Moolah apparently, allegedly, was having her way with some of her talents. Very, very bizarre, very interesting. I mean, this is like, like, oh gosh, what's the thing with the tigers and the people that, it's one of those Netflix kind of
Yeah.
things that run for a series.
It's amazing that in some ways this hasn't been picked up by more mainstream outlets to make a big deal out of, because
Right.
there is so much material there that people wouldn't. I mean, it's so bizarre that it almost has to be true, because if you made it up, no one would believe it.
Right. I mean, there's definitely stuff to run with here to do a very interesting docu-series on, but
And again, it's like, what do you do with Moolah as a figure? There's no women's wrestling history without her, but it's not all. I mean, what's there is controversial at best, but partly is she a victim herself of an abuser and a system, and she just repeated those abuses? Doesn't make it right, not an excuse, but it's just a broken. It shows just how broken the system was for women all along, and how stacked the deck had become by the time that women were able to make a change. Just that momentum that was working against them.
Again, not to defend her actions, or like you say, not to excuse it, but when I was reading through the material, I really began to think, where it's so cyclical with what Billy Wolfe did, then what Moolah did. Was that just the Moolah thinking, well, this is the way it's done.
Yeah,
I'm taking this over, so this is how I'm going to do things.
this is how business works. Exactly. I mean, again,
I mean,
not
that's a
an
very
excuse.
twisted mentality, but I mean, that's what she came up in, to get back to that, the abused becomes the abuser kind of, narrative there. It, mm,
There's a
I,
lot of ways that one can look at it, and none of them are clear cut, and none of them are really pretty.
this
And
is true.
you can't have the conversation though on women's wrestling and leave her out of it. And obviously, we are leaving a lot of women out of the conversation just because of time. You got your
Right.
Mae Youngs, you got a lot of folks who contributed to the early days of wrestling. But Moolah was women's wrestling by and large for 30 years, and until the modern era, really, when Vince McMahon took over for his father,
Mhm.
Moolah saw the writing on the wall. There was not going to be any more going around the world just booking myself and my girls and my stable of girls. She knew that the time of territories were done, and that if she wanted to work, she'd sell out to the man, and which she did. So she joined the WWF at the time. And Doug, this is where I first remember women's wrestling.
You
And
see, I don't even remember women's wrestling here. You know, Wendy Richter, sure, I know this name, but I cannot imagine a single match. I cannot recall a single match.
really,
It took me like going back through and like doing research on this to go, oh yeah, Wendy Richter.
so
I know that name. I know this face, but I can't think of a single match she was in. I
I
don't
think
recall
that
one.
it's got to be the difference in me just being slightly older than you, and probably me having access to the WWF slightly before you did.
I think that's definitely it. You're a year older than me. Come on.
A year older than you, and probably a year ahead of you as far as getting to watch WWE, which at the time
Fair
when
enough.
kids, that 2 year swing could be a big difference, because this is what I remember occasionally seeing, like women on the card that you'd never see again. It'd be one of those, oh, there's a women's match. Boy, that's strange. And then they'd be gone. There was no storylines. There was no anything until the 80s. Wendy Richter. By this point, Moolah had sold out to Vince. She's still representing herself as the women's champion. This is the first women's storyline that I recall. It was based around WrestleMania. It was WrestleMania season. It was the Rock and Wrestling Connection. It was Cyndi Lauper.
Mhm.
That that's how I remember all this. So you don't remember all that? Was that actually before you had WWF?
It was because I recognized Cyndi Lauper as more of a women's wrestler in my brain than I do Wendy Richter, because through Captain Lou Albano, I think you're probably right. There's that connection that goes through Cyndi Lauper to bring me into women's wrestling for the WWF. Because again, it took me researching this to go, oh yeah, okay, it was Wendy Richter who was Cyndi Lauper's champion
Yep.
against Moolah.
Yes.
Who was Captain Lou's, champion, and what was it? Oh, it was a Rock and Wrestling. Was it at a pay-per-view? Or
maybe
was it
Saturday Night Main Event? I think
it was
there you go. Main Event. So, I mean, it was definitely a big deal, and it was unusual to see women's wrestling portrayed as a big deal. And it was a big deal because Moolah, at least being billed, I know there was some stop gaps in there where it was, maybe a night or two she didn't have the title. But for the most part, she did have the championship for 28 years, and they advertised it as such, as like no one's beat her in 28 years. And then along comes, Wendy Richter, and they hook her up with a popular pop star like Cyndi Lauper, and they made a big deal about it. Prior to her sudden rise to fame, Wendy Richter had begun her professional wrestling career back in like the NWA. She was a tag team, was a champion with Joyce Grable, who was a women's wrestler of the 70s, who kind of carried the torch during that era, some of these really darker eras. And for Wendy Richter, it was being shot to the top of a card in a way that probably took her by surprise. And years later, despite the fact that she's forever tied with Moolah and being the one to take the belt from Moolah, she was one of those who had trained at Moolah's training camp, and then was years later one of those that came forward and said, Moolah didn't train anybody. Yeah. Moolah took your money, and other people did the training for her.
And it sounds like those other people who did the training were just other wrestlers in the stable and weren't really even compensated for training.
Yes. Wendy, unfortunately, Vince had short attention span, and after everything died down with Moolah, she kind of had a screw job, played on her, where they put the belt back on Moolah, and she wasn't really anticipating that was the way it was going to go. And then that was kind of the end of Vince's run with women's wrestling in the 80s. And it should be noted, Doug, that even though we talk about this being like kind of a dark era where women didn't have a lot of opportunities, during this same time over in Japan, there was a women's renaissance with Joshi wrestlers. The 80s was considered, the real genesis of women's wrestling, just not here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had the I guess the 80s revolution or the golden age of wrestling here, but I guess the Joshi wrestlers really took off in the 80s there. Well, and here's a lady we really have to talk about with women's wrestling too, even though I don't remember her wrestling all that many women, quite honestly.
Well, this is where we move into the 90s, Doug. And, after we get out of the 80s and the Moolah, era's done and Wendy Richter is forgotten, women's wrestling's forgotten, we move to the 90s and you start to see some opportunities. It's the Attitude Era. You start to see a lot of sexploitation. Women were featured prominently. They just weren't necessarily featured very flatteringly, at least not as equal wrestlers, right?
So, but China is a very special case because I think Triple H, I don't know if it was Triple H or Shawn Michaels, came up with the idea to use China as leader for them, because you have these two big boys who have a bodyguard that is a female, and that female happens to look like this. I think that is a brilliant way to portray, a female in wrestling. I mean, especially when she's built like China was. That was a great gimmick, for China. But we can't really talk about her as necessarily a women's wrestler, though, in at least what I'm thinking is traditional sense, where she's wrestling other women.
Well, I wanted to call her out here because of the we talk about towering figures in the history of women's wrestling. You have to look back and not any one person is responsible for a turnaround, but you have to give her the props, because at a time when women were not given a lot of opportunity, she was an exception to the rule for sure. And that's why, again, you say she's not a traditional women's wrestler. She wasn't doing the bra and panty matches and things with like the other women were being made to do at the time. So who does she wrestle? She wrestles men. She was actually portrayed as a serious female performer. They just weren't portraying anyone else as such. So she really had no competition.
This is true, but you also look, and there's this through line that you start to see, because back to, what was it, Mildred, and then Moolah, with Billy Wolfe, you see women aligning themselves with these men of power, and then China, you know I mean, he's married to the boss's daughter now, but she was aligned with Triple H back then, and Triple H was part of the clique with Shawn Michaels, who was very much in favor of Vince McMahon. So she was essentially a member of the clique. So she's getting her, I don't want to say special treatment, but essentially special treatment. She had the ear of the boss, just like Moolah before her.
She was treated differently for sure, but she was different. You can just look at her. She
Absolutely.
didn't look like any women's wrestler that we'd seen before. And she was believable. I mean, when she was wrestling men and beating men, you didn't look at it as like something that was out of the realm of possibility. You look at her.
Not. Like, yeah. You're like, yep, that checks out. I mean, look at her,
And, it should be noted that at the time, women's wrestling in general in the 90s was being portrayed like this. And this is no slam on any of these women, because actually you look at the women that are in this photo, there's some really good wrestlers in this.
There is a lot of talent here. I mean, Trish and Lita, they are often looked at as, the pre-revolutionary leaders there in the women's revolution.
So Doug, to me, I know that women's wrestling in the 90s, it was typified by sexploitation. It was typified by 2-minute matches. I mean, you just went out there and you did some little bit, or maybe had a bra and panty match or mud wrestling or something, and you were done. People look down on that era of wrestling, in women's wrestling. But it's really not fair to look down on the women themselves, because that's just kind of kicking them twice, because it wasn't talent that held these women back. It was opportunity. If you're not given the opportunity, whenever they were given the opportunity, a lot of these women showed that they were capable of more. They just weren't allowed to do it.
I mean, I talk about, I think I was talking about this last week, Lita's first appearance in WWE is ingrained into my brain, because I'm like, who is this chick doing Hurricane Ranas off the top rope? Nobody even knows who Essa Rios is now except me, because Lita debuted with Essa Rios.
And I remember Trish walking out as the valet for TNA.
TNA, oh my God, that's right. That was so bad. Yes.
Test and Albert.
And Albert.
She was more talented than either of those two. And yes. She was. And when she got a chance to show it, she was a trailblazer and is recognized as such now. So, I think we need to give credit where it's due to a lot of these women that, if they were in this era, would have been even more legendary. Your Alundra Blazes, for example, your Luna Vachons, your Molly Hollies, Jazz,
yeah.
Victoria, I mean, Michelle McCool. I mean, these are women that could, Beth Phoenix, these are women that could actually wrestle. They just were in that in between. They were Gail Kim.
Can't forget Gail Kim.
Actually, Doug, I want to talk Gail Kim, because awesome. I think that sometimes when we talk women's revolution, or we talk about these trailblazers here who bared the brunt of the worst of it and helped get us there, I think that people focus too much on WWE and the fact that Impact, even though they had the beautiful people and they were just as guilty with a lot of the sex that they were portraying, but they also were the ones that gave Gail Kim and Awesome Kong multi-year storyline and gave them main events and matches that were still years in the future for WWE. And then once WWE started doing something similar, they were getting credit for things that Impact had kind of already done, but just doesn't get the credit for, with the likes of Gail Kim and Awesome Kong.
Absolutely, because I put those Kim Kong matches up there with Angle Samoa Joe when Angle was in Impact. I mean, you're absolutely right. They were light years ahead of what WWE was doing. And even when WWE had Awesome Kong, they didn't know what to do with her other than call her Karma, and and and, and really just burn that off as quick as they brought her in. But
Mickey James.
yes,
Work that Mickey did. We could call out a lot of women in this time that were better than the material they were given, and then when they were given a little, they would make a lot out of it, and they bridged the gap into the modern era. Doug, where would you place the Bellas? I think the Bellas are a bit of an odd bridge. They had the stigma of coming in as like, oh, here comes more of the models and diva search and things like that. But they were really after the Attitude Era, but before the Women's Revolution. And if you look back on the Bellas, I think that maybe you could look at them as a bit of that glue that takes us from what it was to what it became.
Yeah, I think bridge is definitely the best word for them, because they definitely bridged the divas to the women's champions. I think they were in the end of the divas. Oh, and we can't forget about Natty either. I mean, we're talking about a heart there,
Yes.
who apparently is just a good hand. But you know, and I think the Bellas probably are. I mean, that's excellent. Calling them a bridge from one to the next, because how long did Nikki hold the women's title? You know,
And for as beautiful as they undoubtedly were coming out of the model world and things, they learned the game. And Nikki in particular was, I think, maybe underrated as a wrestler, because some people might have still tried to associate her with an era that was gone, and without realizing just how much she'd advanced.
and I think I myself have been guilty of that in the past. But you're absolutely right. There was advancement there. There are definitely girls who were, in my opinion, better than her, but
Oh, yeah.
again, you have that again that odd little line there that kind of keeps rearing its ugly head, because for a lot of her reign, she was in a relationship with John Cena, who was at the top of his game too. So women, there keeps coming this recurring theme where we see. I'm not saying she didn't deserve her spot, but oh yeah, we'll talk about these girls. This is the women's revolution right here. But again, I don't think any of these gals have that, other than one's dad being Ric Flair. You know,
Well, I mean, you have that bridge era where, how do you fit these in? They're not Attitude Era. They weren't the Sexploitation era, but they weren't quite Women's Revolution era. I think let's talk about, where we are today. And where we are today isn't possible without these four and NXT, really, right? I mean, isn't that
absolutely.
really where the women's revolution started? It wasn't a Stephanie McMahon thing on Raw or SmackDown the
Yeah,
way it's.
Stephanie McMahon did not create women's wrestling.
I mean, it's the groundwork of the women before, and I'm not just talking about the folks that deserve better, like your Beth Phoenixes or your Michelle McCools or your Mickey James or Trish Stratus. I'm talking about all the way back to Mildred. And if you want to show some grace to Moolah and the treatment she had, those women all went through it to get to the point where these four women changed the perception of women's wrestling, because, as an audience, we are trained by the company to react certain ways. We are trained who the bad guy is, who the good guy is, what a main event is, what Santino does is comedy, and we're supposed to laugh at that. And what, Ric Flair does is, serious when he's in a main event. And so we, ooh and ah at that. But women's wrestling, these women not only had to overcome the feelings of Vince McMahon, they had to overcome our feelings. The audience, who for years had been fed a steady diet of TNA matches, fans chanting puppies and all this kind of stuff. That's what these women had to face, and they had to turn around the attitude of the audience before they ever got the attention of the promoter.
I look at these girls and I think none of these girls are divas. Is that because they of the time they're in? If they were about in the '80s, would they have been divas? Would they have had these chances, or would they have been our Trish Stratuses and our leaders at that time?
They would have been. They would have
Yeah,
been. Yeah.
absolutely. But
Yeah.
we're to that point now where women can headline WrestleMania. That the Bailey and Sasha Banks matches at Barclays Center, that one NXT takeover. My God, I think that is the start of the revolution right there. Not to shortchange anything that Becky Lynch or Charlotte have brought to the table, but that kicks it off, and then they have the Iron Woman match after that. You know,
You
female
think that?
hell in the cells. I mean,
Yes.
it just explodes, and I think these four lead it. And again, there's not that through line of them sleeping with anybody or anything like that, but you do have that through line of Triple H, the great, the daddy of black and gold NXT, not the 2.0 that we're getting now. But this, I think there's a bit of his vision there, maybe going back to what he saw with China back in the day, and saying, okay, this is different. I can work with this. Let's take things in a different way.
And the four horsewomen here, they deserve all the credit in the world for champion, being the change that led to the women's revolution. But by no means were they alone in that. I think that it's also, even though they weren't members of this particular group, you can't discount, as you mentioned, that Natty, who's still there. And I would say that you have to give credit to Paige, the first NXT women's champion, who actually was on the scene before these four women were, and was taken seriously, was not presented as a sideshow attraction or just someone good to look at. She was presented as a talented wrestler, and obviously had uncanny abilities for a teenager, and really, because of her unfortunate injury that took her out, I think sometimes she doesn't get included into that revolution talk, because you see those four women and you picture them together, but you got to put her right next to them.
In that same breath, you got to give a nod to AJ Lee, who passed the torch beautifully to Paige on her Raw debut, when she rolls out challenges for the female champion, the women's championship, and it was still a Divas belt at that time, right? Yeah, it was still a Divas championship.
I mean, and now you got rid of a lot of these stigmas, and fans have accepted it. I mean, and again, I had to be retrained too. I didn't. I may not have been there, hollering puppies or anything like that, but I wasn't looking at the women's match with the same anticipation that I looked to for the men's matches, because I was trained for decades to think they weren't as important. And as soon as they started treating them as equally important, suddenly I'm as invested in their storylines, and sometimes more so, depending on what they are. I don't see any difference between them now. Doug, to kind of put a fine point on it and bring us to where we are today, we're in an era where WWE, if you look at the broader ecosystem of NXT and NXT UK, you have 6 women's championships within the WWE ecosystem. And there was a time that you could go years and not even see a woman on television wrestling for WWE. To me, that's amazing progress.
That's amazing, but why have we only had one women's revolution, like pay-per-view, all women pay-per-view? Is that because it was like the lowest performing pay-per-view? And why was that? Does that go back to what you're talking about, how we've had to be retrained, but as a audience overall, and the general audience, the casual fans don't really get it just yet?
I think while women's wrestling is presented at the same level now as men's, and you see that with Ronda Rousey and folks like, at the top of the card or headlining WrestleMania, Sasha and Bianca. I think that the idea of entire women's pay-per-views is something that they need to look at again. You can't judge based on one outing how it's going to be moving forward. It didn't perform as well as most pay-per-views do, but we're in the network era now, so what would it really matter to try it again and train us, show people that this is important, and the fans will come. The fans were not sitting on their hands during the Ronda Rousey main event, nor were they during the main event of Bianca versus Sasha. You treat it as important, we will follow and get into it if it's good, and there's enough talented women out there. And I guess that's where I want to leave, Doug. We got AEW, who is overloaded with talent right now on the women's side, WWE, who has 6 women's champions, which again just blows my mind. Who's next? I mean, when you look at the women's scene, who's the next trailblazer? Who's impressing you on like the AEW side? We'll start out with.
So on AEW, I've got to give a nod to Britt Baker. I mean, she already has she's already the top shelf there, with the women's champion. And I think Jade Cargill has still ways to go with her mic work. But my goodness, I've never seen someone, she has an amazing look. And it helps for me being a comic book geek that, she models that look after Storm from the X-Men. But she has an amazing look. She's great in the ring. She gets better each and every day. Eventually, she will move from the TBS belt to the AEW Women's Championship. I see that happening.
I remember not being impressed with her when she first started. Yes, she came out in that Shaq, and I get it. I mean, you want to shoot her to the moon, so you put her on there with a celebrity. She wasn't ready.
She wasn't ready, but
that first night she tried to go toe-to-toe with Brandy on the mic, and you and I both thought, oh my gosh, this lady's awful. Mm-hmm. And like you, I'm glad you mentioned her. To me, even though she's a champion right now, I still would say that she's a diamond in the rough as far as where she's going to go. She's shown so much growth and improvement that I think that she's a future star, for like a long-term star, and eventual will be the one to unseat the Good Doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sheeta, I've been impressed with Sheeta for years. You've seen me pop for her live. So, AEW has so much talent, and I don't think the women especially are getting, the airtime that they need. I don't see AEW doing an all women's, premium live event anytime soon.
But they could. They had a rough start to their women's division. They've done a lot better, I think, over the last year or so. But it's almost like with the men. They have so much talent and so little airtime that a lot of the really talented women that they have on the roster, you would only see if you watch their YouTube shows, Dark and Elevation, which is full of women's matches. Outside of their stars, your Thunder Roses and things like that, as far as young women I'm seeing on there that I think are going to, I think Julia Hart has something. Has an it factor about her, and she's really good in the ring. Sky Blue is someone who hasn't been picking up a lot of wins, but if you watch her on Elevation, the work she does, very impressive. Kiera Hogan, who was really, really impressive in Impact and hasn't got to show that yet on AEW. She's, resigned to YouTube on Tuesday nights, but I mean, they almost have an abundance of women's talent that they don't know what to do with, which of course is WWE's problem as well.
Right.
Yeah. Obviously all the 4 horsewomen are still out there and still active and still are going to have many years to contribute. But if I just look at like folks that I think are up and coming, Nikita Lyons on NXT, it has a unique look, a unique charisma. I mean, she's only had one match on NXT proper, but she's been doing the NXT Level Up show for a while. Check her out if you haven't. She will be big time before you know it. Raquel Gonzalez is another who I know is a champion. I wasn't impressed with at first, but now she's got both mic skills and physical attributes and look. And then I would call out Cora Jade, who is only just turned 20 and is a modern Paige. So I think that the future of WWE's women's division is strong because you can look like a generation down from the 4 horsewomen who are still out there and doing it, and you're going to see some really, really talented women that are just in need of an opportunity. And I guess that's what it's still all about. It was back in Mildred's day, and it is today.
It is all about oh yeah, I just googled Nikita Lyons and landed on her Instagram. Okay.
Unique, man, unique. You just wait till you see her in the ring.
And yeah, definitely Raquel Gonzalez. I'm not familiar with a lot of the NXT talent right now, but Raquel, I think Raquel won me over when we saw her live, which seems like 1,000 years ago now, pre-pandemic, but
pretty much.
But yeah, she's come so far since then. the future is rich. I mean, there's so much talent just in wrestling in general across the board with so many promotions, male and female. And I think we're in a golden age where finally we're at a place where women wrestlers can get the respect that they've always should have had. And I think the future is just very bright for wrestling in general. And I've said this probably too many times, but it's just a great time to be a wrestling fan. I mean, we're not in the heyday of the '80s when Raw can draw 8 million people, every time it's on air. But for us to appreciate wrestling, this is a great time, man.
Yeah, we're also not back in the Mildred Burke days where a trailblazer is left sitting in the lobby while her ex-husband decides the fate of all of women's wrestling. So
Exactly.
While we have seen a ton of improvement thanks to all the trailblazers we've talked about, and the future is definitely bright, we're still not quite to equality yet. The women's rosters, when it comes to Rumble time, you're still having to pull legends and things because they don't have quite enough. It's not, we're not to the point of being equal just yet. So there's still room to grow. But I don't think there's any putting the genie back in the bottle. Like there's not going to be any more chance of puppies or boring or things like that. Fans have indicated we want women's wrestling. We believe in these women. Give us more of this, and hopefully that just leads to still bigger and better things.
That's an interesting point where you're having your women's Royal Rumble, but they have to draw on their legends. Is that because their roster is so thin? Because I don't think maybe the main roster is not there, but is there an argument to be made that we need to bring in more female talent from years past to draw the casual wrestling fans in? Of course, then that's a shame on you, company, for not promoting what you have here already.
I would give the same condemnation to AEW. Again, a good majority of their talented women's roster is only featured on Monday and Tuesdays on YouTube. I think that while both federations have an abundance of women talent to work with, they still, despite having more opportunity than the days of yesteryear, these women still aren't featured in the same amount of time if you broke it down by minutes as the men. So it's not a 50-50 by any means. So it's still more difficult out there for women, which I think is an important way to maybe end this discussion while we talk about the golden age of women's wrestling being today. And it is compared to all our previous eras. I think the true golden age of women's wrestling is hopefully still to come because there's still some ground to be made up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's hope for it.
Let's hope.
Go Tony and Vince. I think once you get maybe some representation in the top spot of these organizations, women's wrestling has always been controlled by men. I think the day that you have a Stephanie McMahon actually in that main chair, you might see a little more in the way of 50-50 booking with the men and women talent, hopefully.
Yeah.
And with that, Doug, we're going a little long. You ready to hit our big finish?
Let's hit the big finish. Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. What do you have, my friend, for your botch of the week?
So, I was looking for a botch and a match of the week this week. I haven't been able to watch a lot of wrestling because I've had some demands at the day job that have kept me away from wrestling. So I'm stepping back from both. And I really wanted to kind of follow the theme here and try and find something, in the women's realm. I really couldn't, but again, that's not because there's nothing out there that could be a match of the week. It's just that I didn't consume a lot of wrestling in the past week, so I have really nothing for a botch or a match of the week. I do have a performer, which I want to talk about because I did catch something that just blew me away. And I have a lot of questions about where this performer goes after this amazing promo that was cut. But
let me do botch and match of the week, and then we'll end on performer since you have
sure.
that to say. So botch of the week for me is whatever the heck it was last week on Dynamite that Alex Abrahantes thought he was doing there with Penta. on the same broadcast where you have Eddie Kingston doing this amazing promo about we're not the sports entertainment company, suddenly you have Alex
cosplaying as Dracula.
Cosplay Dracula, and Kenta popping up behind a tombstone that would have made 1990s Undertaker blush. We got to call them out when they do the sports entertainment stuff as cheesy as WWE can do it, and AEW is obviously not immune to that. That was not good. Penta deserved better than that. And then match of the week, Doug, I'm going with AEW here and Rampage last Friday night. Daniel Garcia versus Bryan Danielson. I just can't believe the renaissance that Bryan Danielson is in the midst of. The man is pushing what is he, 40 something? 40,
I'm going to say 40-ish. Yeah.
And having some of the best matches of his career with everyone on the card. It doesn't matter who you put him in the ring with. He's going to have the best match on the show. He probably will this Sunday with Moxley, very likely. And the match with Garcia was amazing. So check it out.
I caught the beginning of Rampage because I really thought that, that Sammy Guevara match with, the former La Sombra was going to be amazing. It just seemed really clunky. And then I haven't had a chance to finish Rampage yet. So I will check that out because I was thinking, well, this is surely going to be my match of the week. And then it's like, oh, this wasn't quite. And just seems, I don't know. It's just a passing match. Yeah, but I'll have to check that out. But
let's talk. You got a performer you want to highlight?
Man, can we just talk just briefly about that promo that MJF cut on Dynamite? My goodness, this is a kid who lives and breathes his gimmick. This is a kid who understands old school wrestling. I can only imagine. I see totally what Cody has seen in him, and I can only think how proud Dusty would be of a promo like that. I mean, my goodness, that just brings everybody in, and then really the announcers play off of it perfectly and do what announcers in wrestling should do is enhance the action in the ring, and in this case enhancing the promo that MJF cut. And CM Punk, to his credit, comes out then and does that. Is this real? Is that real? Just that sliver of wait. Are you doing a hardcore heel thing here? And then this goes another way, or was that real? Even MJF's tears, man. Come on. How is there not going to be a bidding war in 2024 for this kid?
It was fantastic top to bottom, and I guess maybe almost makes him a de facto face in this now. It's like,
that's what I said. Is this a face? I'm
even
like,
MJF.
Is this a face turn for MJF? And he's like, what?
I saw where MJF's mother even thinks that he might be all right now. So I mean,
I love that.
Yeah, excellent work. I'm going out of the box completely on this one with my performer of the week. We don't talk John Cena much on this show. John Cena doesn't get, for better or worse, John Cena doesn't get credit from the internet wrestling community at large. I think in general, he is not the villain that a lot of people make him out to be, and is probably better in the ring than most people make him out to be. Certainly not my favorite performer by any means, but I have to talk about the fact that now that it's concluded, if you haven't seen Peacemaker, now I know Doug will disagree with me here because his favorite John Cena work was the early days in the Raps, but I think this is the best stuff that John Cena has ever done. If you haven't, I won't spoil it for you, folks. But if you like Gunn's work on Suicide Squad and Guardians of the Galaxy, this show right from the beginning, the opening dance sequence alone. I mean, I for all 8 episodes, I never skipped it. You always skip the intro of a show after you see the first.
You do not skip it. You sit there and watch it, and it's not like some other like a Simpsons where the couch gag is different every time, so you want to watch it. It's the same thing over and over, but it is just so good.
It's insane, and this show is dumb. It is so stupid. And it's so smart, and it's so sad, and it's so funny, and sometimes all at the same time. So
yes,
Yeah,
Absolutely. And that's something that James Gunn is amazing with,
yes.
doing all that. I mean, worth it just to see John Cena sit down at a old beat down piano and play Home Sweet Home.
Because, Doug, there is never not a good time to rock. And that is one takeaway that I got from Peacemaker. So if you haven't seen Peacemaker, kudos to John Cena for reinventing himself and putting himself in a position to succeed. He honestly is perfect for the role, between the build and his deadpan sense of humor and his, penchant for potty humor that he can deliver with the same sort of clueless humor that he's also very, very good at. He's just excellent in this role. So throw the dog an invisible bone, folks, and watch Peacemaker. John Cena, my performer of the week.
I cannot disagree with that.
And with that,
I really enjoyed Peacemaker.
fantastic. I enjoyed Peacemaker. I enjoyed tonight's discussion on women's wrestling, a very important topic any
Absolutely.
time of year, but especially here during Women's History Month, that we pay credit to all the women that paved the way, including those that are still doing so today. But thank you all for joining us on a Tuesday night. Doug and I, we're going to be back on Sunday night on our more familiar schedule, except instead of 8 p.m., we're going to have to be live after a pay-per-view on Sunday. Doug, we're talking Revolution. You're going to be excited. It's AEW.
Yes. So, Tony will be watching to see what I thought. So
join us Sunday night after AEW Revolution. And then, as you can see, the rest of March, special WrestleMania programming, more details on that to come. You're going to be excited. We're excited. We'll see you guys on Sunday night. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.